Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be responding to Matt Dillahunty's response to G-Man. Now let's get this straight. G-Man is a loon, and I have critiqued him in the past on a separate channel. With that said, I am sort of tired of this issue of Old Testament slavery being brought up, and Matt is simply a well enough known atheist whom uses it as a rock to bash people of the Abrahamic religions with. I'll be using Tyndale's scholarly commentary series to answer Matt's objections, and leave out his prelude and some of his jabs at G-Man. Let's go.
Exodus 21 begins to describe the law with regard to Hebrew servants, or actually male Hebrew servants, because women are a completely separate category in the Bible, especially women slaves, but we'll get to that in a little bit.
I'm picking up a sort of they distinguished between the sexes, therefore sexism from Matt. Now, I'll for the sake of charity assume that isn't what Matt means, but for anyone who does hold to that, it's a non sequitur, as distinctions between sexes can be for many reasons, with sexism not being a single reason.
First of all, it's not true. It is not true that the Bible only advocates for indentured servitude. It does advocate for both indentured servitude and slavery. And the second reason that it's bad is because indentured servitude is probably also immoral. It's not like there's a good system in place to protect these people who are in debt slavery. It's a very problematic system. It is prone to exploitation, and the rules that are in place in the Bible, even if indentured servitude wasn't already a problem, don't make any sense.
Now, he is yet to give his argument to the first, but in regards to the second, when was it claimed to be the perfect system? It was what Yahweh deemed was right for his people at the time in order to get his word across. The law, according to Christians, was made to one day be fulfilled, and even Jews will grant people fail Yahweh and his wishes, so the fact it isn't perfect isn't a surprise.
Want to plot of land? 6 years. Want a cow? Is that 6 years? What if I want 2 cows? Is that 6 years? Is it 12 years? Is it 6 years? I don't understand. There's one thing. If you go and sell yourself into servitude, you serve for 6 years. Shouldn't it matter what you're trying to get out of it? None of this makes any sense.
That's because ancient Near East law codes were didactic. They educated rulers and judges, but were idealistic and not meant to be taken in a penal notion like how you're applying it.
Exodus 21 verses 20 and 21. This is from the New King James. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property.
Exodus 21:20 through 21 laws are of a causatic faction, i.e. from general principles. As R. L. Cole notes in his commentary on the Exodus book, the great advance on ancient thinking is that a slave is considered here as a person. His master has no right to beat him to death deliberately, even though the slave may be his property. But if the slave lingers a while before dying, the supposition is that the master intended only to correct him, not to kill him. This is accidental homicide, and the financial loss occurred by the master in the death of the slave is considered punishment and less than enough. The slave is really treated no different than your free persons in the brawling incident, as rod beatings were a means of discipline and intentionality was taken into consideration. Property can also be translated as money here. The slave is his money regardless if we're going the indentured servant route or not, because they will be working and the master will be making the master his money. Labor output is what is being considered, not ownership. The eye for an eye is a principle, not a rule, and judges would interpret it according to the case at hand. If there was no intent to seriously harm them, but they did that would be taken into consideration, and that would also be taken into account.
In verses 28 and 29, there's a passage about if your bull has a habit of goring people and you don't keep it pinned up and it runs rampant and gores somebody and kills them, the bull is stoned to death and you are killed because you're negligent. But if that bull goes and kills a slave, well, the bull still has to die, but the owner of the bull is not killed. He just has to pay 30 shekels to the owner of the slave.
Again with R. Allen Cole, if the ox gores a slave in the case of a free man, relatives might agree to accept a blood price. In the case of a slave, they must do so. This is one of the few differences between bond and free that still existed in Israel. 30 shekels of silver was the standard price for a slave at the time. Even in Israel, a slave was still a man. His blood brings blood guilt like that of any other man. The negligent owner wasn't charged of murder, but rather culpable homicide. The difference here between the master and the servant isn't in humanity, but rather status and who is affected by it. If a master was killed, that hurt his wife and child, who would be without support, and so would the servant, but really assuming the servant had no family outside of the relationship with his master, the only one hurt is the master, which is why there's a difference in the punishment.
In Leviticus, we begin to see the difference between hired servants and slaves. And if one of your brethren who dwells with you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. And he shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with rigor, but you shall fear your God.
For Leviticus 25:39 through 41 and Leviticus 25:42 through 43, I'll be going to J. Sklar in his commentary. He does mention the difference between indentured servants and permanent foreign servants, i.e. not slaves. This law, as you noted, pretty much abolished Israelites having each other as permanent servants. Since the permanent servant wasn't a member of the people, he didn't get the benefits of having an auto-release, which you could say was a way of getting them to become members. While they may serve for life, and some may want to, this wasn't necessarily the case, as the Mendelsohn makes clear they could be freed upon their master's death if they were caring for them, or they could make money to bail themselves out, or have someone pay them out. The master could not do with them as they pleased, as the master had to be compassionate, couldn't intentionally abuse them, and the slaves could even observe the Sabbath. They had legal rights and were protected, which is why servant is used. Servants from other lands could be bought because they were selling themselves in their own land. This was a common practice back then.
In Numbers 31, for example, after smiting the Midianites and returning with the women and children, Moses was mad that they brought back these women and children and gave them specific instructions. Now they're starting with verse 17. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man intimately. But keep for yourselves all the young girls who have not known a man intimately. Well, how do you go about finding out whether a young girl has known a man intimately? I mean, that seems kind of intrusive and gross, but hey, after all, they're slaves. It doesn't matter if we violate them.
The reason the non-virgin girls were killed was because they had forced themselves onto the Israelite men, despite likely having husbands of their own, and knew the men of Israel had wives along with got them to do idol worshipping. Balaam arranged it so he could get Yahweh to kill Israelites, and the Midianites supported it. Also, you would only have to look at the women's clothes and jewelry to know they were virgins, as back then women would broadcast their virginity. The virgin women were spared because they couldn't have been involved in the sin, and they likely wouldn't have been a threat. Sex slavery has to be read into the Bible, as from all known historical evidence, that's generally not what captive women were for. They were basically used for chores. The little boys were killed because in an honor society, little boys of conquered lands felt obligated to get payback. At worst, the virgin girls would have been around 5 years old, so you would be accusing them of a lot more than just having sex slaves. At best, assuming they were close to the age of marriage, they would become believers in Yahweh and His covenant, and they would marry the warriors, which the woman might like since they were now without support since their husbands and fathers had died from the war, and because the warriors had honor.
But in Exodus 21:7, we get a clearer picture of what female slaves were for. And if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. Now, here we're talking about Hebrew females, because Hebrew males have to be let go after 6 years, but Hebrew females didn't have to be let go. As a matter of fact, they were your property forever. She shall not go out as the male slaves do. In verse 8, if she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself. So he bought a slave, and she's going to be his wife or concubine or plaything. And if she doesn't please him, then he shall let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her.
Figures a guy with sex on the brain has this idea. Pleasing doesn't necessitate sex, but could be that she has shown herself to not be able to work well enough, or might just not be seen as wife material anymore. Since he promised her to either himself or his son, and he isn't planning on honoring his promise, he has wronged her and is thus required to let her go.
We're talking about a book that has a law requiring a rape victim to marry her rapist and never divorce him. Deuteronomy 22, verse 28. If a man finds a young woman who's a virgin who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall have to give the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife because he has humbled her, and he shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days.
As Edward Wood notes in his commentary, this law reflects that found at Exodus 22:16 through 17, but here the situation involves the complementary case of the seduction of an unbetheled virgin. Therefore, there is no question of capital offense because no marriage or betrothal has apparently been compromised. So no rape, but rather just seduction.
If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Now, the Bible's pretty clear, as we pointed out, that Hebrew servants are different from slaves, the way they're treated and the fact that they have to be let go after 6 years, but this only applies to the males, and if you bought a male with his wife, you have to let them both go. But if you buy yourself a Hebrew servant, and you give him a wife, and she bears him children, when his 6 years are up, you get to keep the wife and children, but the Hebrew servant can go out. Well, who wants to do that? I mean, if I've come to love someone and we've had a family together, how likely am I to be to leave them? And the Bible continues from there. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, which is something that a lot of people would just go say, you know, I don't want to leave my family behind, I'm willing to stay. Then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Now, when the Bible's entirely about making sure that Hebrew slaves are not treated the same as other slaves, that they don't become your property forever, that you have to let them go after 6 years. And we can talk about Jubilee and the 50-year thing some other time and how that's probably a contradiction to this idea of forever and permanent, etc. But when the Bible makes that point over and over again, and then it says, hey, if you buy a male Hebrew servant, give him a wife, and he decides he doesn't want to leave, all of a sudden he's your property forever, that's a loophole.
What Matt seems to not know is that in ancient times, getting married to someone you love was considered a luxury, and this was the case till really, I believe, the Industrial Revolution. This is actually a progressive provision because in many cultures, you wouldn't be allowed to stay with your wife and child even if you loved them. Before the Industrial Revolution, marriages served more like business deals where ideally both families benefited and love had to be developed later. A servant whom was just given a work wife would likely not feel any special commitment to her, and likely the woman wouldn't feel any to him either. The servants here both likely didn't have families outside of their arrangements, so the master functioned as a family for the woman and child, so things had to be negotiated through the master. R. Alan Cole points out this is a possible relic of a Neolithic matriarchal society where a relationship to a mother was considered more valuable than to the father. A pierced ear in of itself wouldn't be considered slavery necessarily, but rather spiritual obedience, and overall this provision ensured the woman and her child would have support from someone.
God taking human form and coming down and sacrificing himself to serve as a loophole for rules that he's responsible for. Oh yeah, that's a loophole too.
This shows how Matt is just about recycling atheist memes. Matt misunderstands the Trinity, which is understandable in of itself since no one understands it, but still it should be said Matt conflates the Father and the Son. The Father sent the Son and the Son accomplished the Father's will and died for sinners. Father didn't die, but rather the Son laid his life down for the sin. Matt, I believe, thinks that Yahweh was just sitting in heaven coming up with rules, but under the Christian mythos, the law is an extension of his internal holy nature. Yahweh revealed, according to the Christians, an objective reality.
And yet that's exactly what he's doing. The Bible's position on usury isn't that it's a sin. Exodus 22 verse 25 says, "If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest." But if that's not clear enough, we can go beyond Exodus into Deuteronomy chapter 23, beginning at verse 19. "You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest." Usury wasn't a sin. You just couldn't charge other Jews interest. You could charge foreigners interest all day long. If you can't read a single verse correctly, I'm not sure that it's likely that you're going to read the entire chapter correctly.
As R. Alan Cole points out, this tells how all interest on money lent to a poor man is condemned, and Deuteronomy extends this to Israelites. This prohibition was so the poor would borrow in his need.
It's because this demonstrates that the mental gymnastics that people go through to make excuses for their religious beliefs aren't just bad, they're sad, and they're dangerous. Somehow, religions manage to get people to sacrifice their humanity, their dignity, their self-respect and self-worth on that religion's altar, making them slaves to an ideology.
Good thing I lost my humanity, integrity, self-respect, and self-worth years ago. Now, in all seriousness, I do believe G-Man is a loon, and having watched his objections, I think he came across as more of an idiot than usual, and I showed how little he has looked into this. But with that said, G-Man being stupid doesn't make slightly more intelligent atheists who challenge him right. I disagree with Matt and G-Man on many things, as I don't believe morality as we know it exists, and that it's all an error of sociobiological evolution. I also more obviously disagree with them on the God question. I think this is the first video I've done going after both Christians and atheists, and I'll say it was fun. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.